Journal Club and an open science, small open science group here at Durham for, I think, for a year now, Tweeby, right? So we thought this would be a good opportunity to actually talk about open science with some people who actually spend a lot of time thinking about it, who are experts in the area. And this is why we organized this panel discussion. Thanks, Andrew, for organizing this. This is actually really great. So yeah, so as I said, this will be about open science. I think probably the move towards open science is probably the most important change that is going on at the moment in psychology, probably for the last decades, I think. Many ideas that are related to open science are probably not particularly new, but there is a very powerful, I perceive, shift in that direction, that people are actually really establishing practices, open science practices like sharing data, open material, pre-registrations, things like that. It's probably related, this powerful shift now, to the publication of a very influential paper in 2015 in Science by the so-called Open Science Collaboration that tried to replicate a large number of published findings in psychology and actually came to very, very sobering results in that paper. At least that would be my interpretation. So many people after that were talking about this so-called replication crisis, and open science has been claimed to be one way out of this crisis. So we're talking about these things here. This is what we're going to discuss with our panelists, who will, I will very briefly introduce them. In alphabetical order, we have Natalia Dutra from Rio Grande University, Rio Grande do Norte in Brazil. Natalia is a postdoc. She works on the development of executive functions and processes of cultural learning, and she's interested in promoting open science in Latin America, and she's an assistant director of the Psychological Science Accelerator, and we will probably also talk about what that is today. Next, we have Gordon Feld. Gordon is at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim in Germany. He's a psychologist studying how sleep affects learning, and he says he's an open science enthusiast. He's the founding speaker of the Open Science Interest Group of the Biological Psychology section of the GGPS, which is the German Psychological Society. Then we have Dr. Amy Orben, who is a research fellow at Cambridge University. She investigates social media use, well-being and mental health in adolescents. She won the BPS Award for Outstanding Doctoral Research in 2019, and she's a co-founder of the Reproducibility Initiative, which I really have a hard time pronouncing, sorry for that. And then finally, last but not least, we have Anna Scheel from Eindhoven University. Anna is working on a PhD project. If I understand that correctly, she's in the final year of working on her project about increasing the reliability and efficiency in psychological science, which is supervised by Professor Larkins, who's probably known to many of you as one of the key figures in this whole debate. So I think Andrew already said a little bit about how this is, how we hope this is going to work. We will ask the panelists some questions, and well, I will ask the panelists now to just briefly introduce themselves. After that, we will have a discussion. So I or Tweeby, we will ask some questions that the panelists can then discuss, hopefully. But if you, as the attendees, have any comments or any questions, please put that in the chat box. Please use the chat function. We will monitor that and then hopefully also be able to pick that up. Okay, I think I've talked a lot now, and I think I've talked enough now. Could I please ask Natalia to briefly introduce herself? What is your particular interest in open science, and who are you?
Hi, everyone. I wasn't expecting it to be the first one. So yeah, that's fine. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me for this panel. And I'll try to be brief. I'm Natalia Dutra, or Dutra, it's fine. And I'm a postdoc in Brazil in the Evolution of Human Behavior Laboratory at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. If you're curious, Rio Grande do Norte means the big river of the north in Portuguese. And I'm Brazilian too, but I did my PhD in developmental psychology at the University a few years ago. With a scholarship from my country. So I'm generally interested on how children learn together from each other. and especially interested in the development of executive functions in this context. But I'm also collaborating large-scale projects in cultural learning processes in children and adults, prosocial behavior in children, and moral decisions across cultures. And regarding open science, I've been trying to adopt open science in my own practice. I hardly consider myself an expert, but I'm more of an enthusiast myself as well. I'm trying to adopt these methods, especially when it comes to sharing materials, code, data, and preprints. My main intention is to learn how to improve the transparency and reproducibility of my own work, and hopefully lead by example as well, especially in my community. And I particularly like cognitive psychologist Christina Bergman's buffet approach. And she said something like, we should approach open science as a buffet, choosing what we can eat, but being careful of not stuffing ourselves. And so this is what I've been trying to do here. And on the side, sort of, I've been doing outreach and promoting open science in talks and workshops in my country, and working. I did one in Argentina as well. So I'm trying to also contact other colleagues in Latin America. So that's why I mentioned Latin America at the beginning. I'm working with the Psychological Science Accelerator, which is a decentralized global network of psychological laboratories. I'll paste our link later in the chat. We have over 500 laboratories across over 70 countries right now, and we aim to run and support large-scale collaborations in psychology with these multiple labs over the world. And we are trying to increase also the diversity of the cross-national diversity of psychology by doing that. And currently we are trying to develop tools to support these kind of large collaborations in psychology. I think that's all.
Well, great, thank you. Who wants to go next? Maybe Gordon?
I can go next. I was prepared for it because it's alphabetical order, right? Thank you for inviting me. You've said a couple of things. I will add to that. I would say my interest in open science hasn't been so long. It's more of a recent thing. So I guess I started being really interested about 4 years ago when I heard a talk actually a workshop by Malte Elson that some of you might know. And I think at that point I was still not convinced. And that really was the point where it tipped for me, where I went from denying the problem towards trying to fix it. And that's why I would say I'm an enthusiast. I think it is probably part of the solution to the crisis is open and reproducible science. And I'm interested in applying it and spreading it, this way of doing science. I'm not necessarily very much interested in meta research, which other people on the panel are doing. As doing it myself, I'm interested in what they're doing, but not doing it myself. So yeah, I have a group of PhD students that is working with me, and we are running our studies as registered reports and basically trying to really do the full-blown open science experience here, while I still have a lot of old work that is not so open. So I kind of try to live the balance of still publishing my old work, which is not as open as it should be, but doing all the new stuff in the way I think science should be done. Yeah, you already said I'm the founder of the interest group for open and reproducible science in the biological psychology section of the DGPS. Importantly here, the goal is to look at things that are specific for biological psychology. So there are certain problems like data availability from biological psychology that's much more difficult than behavioral data. Just think of sharing a brain scan, right? I mean, that's much more private data than a tick on a questionnaire, right? I'm also a member of the SIPS award committee since last year, which is an interesting experience, seeing all the cool projects and being able to award some of them. Yeah, and as a ECR representative also in the German Psychological Society, I've been pushing for more open science being established inside our society. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Gordon. Can we then maybe have Amy next, please?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Amy. I'm based at the University of Cambridge as a college research fellow at Emmanuel College. And my academic life intersects with open science at quite a few different kind of parts. So I guess mainly I co-founded the Reproducibility Initiative, which is now has over 100 journal clubs in over 25 different countries. And I chair the leadership group there, maybe not for a lot longer. I've been working a lot on making the leadership of reproducibility more representative, and maybe the end of my time there is coming near because it's become a lot more international, and it's supposed to really represent ECRs, early career researchers, and the problems that they face. So the shelf life of any one person leading the organization is very, very short. So that I kind of organized there, but also locally at my university, I teach the Robust Behavioral Sciences course, which is a grad course now taken by, I think, over 5 different departments, which shows me both the kind of difficulty of teaching open science in a nuanced way so that people can actually argue with people who are not yet on board. And I think that's something I've been really interested in how do we teach it without being dogmatic, and kind of appreciate some of the difficulties as well. Otherwise, I really like open science, doing open science my work. Before I adopted open science, I was very definite of leaving science after my PhD. And after I started adopting it, it was really a watershed moment where I felt like I could do my best. I wouldn't have to worry about what result was publishable or not. I could just do my best work and it would be publishable, and it would make a difference. And so I think that's what makes me most keen about open science. It's not the organization or the teaching, but it's the personal experience. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And then can we please have Anna, please?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to this. It's a very exciting event. Looking forward to it. Yeah, as you've already heard, I'm in my last year, in the last year of my PhD at Eindhoven University of Technology, where I'm actually doing meta science in my PhD. So I'm studying, in particular, registered reports, and I'm interested in the effects they have on how psychologists do their research and the results they find. And if basically, I'm broadly interested in if the reforms that have been suggested in the in response to the replication crisis, what effects they have. And in this research, it's led me to become more broadly interested in how psychologists actually do their research and what research questions they're interested in, since I've discovered that things aren't as black and white as I thought when I went into this, and that real research is messy in interesting ways. So I'm increasingly also, I would say, interested in epistemology and in the role of hypothesis testing, for example, as opposed to other approaches. And so more recently, I've been coming to think that, so more broadly, I think I'm convinced that we owe it to the taxpayer and our human subjects and the general public to do reproducible, reliable research, and not to waste resources on stuff that doesn't replicate, that might not even be transparent enough to even, for other people to even comprehend properly. So I do think there are huge problems we need to address, but we need to figure out how to best do that, right? So I want us to become more efficient, essentially, and how to best do that depends on the goals that we have in different lines of research. So that is one more recent pathway. I think that, some conflicts that we might have grappled with in the last years in the reform movement might also come down to different research goals that people have, and us needing to become a bit more specific and more flexible in figuring out how to solve specific problems depending on which goals you have and what areas you're working in.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. So let's start the discussion, and let's start a little bit at the very beginning, maybe of why many people are interested in this area right now, which is probably the beginning of what has been called the replication crisis. And I think this is always interesting when people start talking about this. I noticed that Gordon, for instance, said that he was only relatively recently, a couple of years back, actually convinced that there is something like a crisis, that we actually do have to think about how we could actually all change our research practices, etc. So I assume that you would all agree on that there is actually a crisis. Why could people think that there might not be a crisis? You might probably be the wrong people to ask that, but can you maybe reflect on that, Nick?
I'm just gonna jump in. And so I think one way to view it is that, well, science is never perfect, right? And scientific progress has always been messy and taking turns, and there have always been things that people have labeled as a crisis, also in psychology. And some people would just say, well, this is just normal. Yeah, we sometimes figure out that things went wrong, that things went into the wrong direction for a while. That's just how things go. And then we change direction a little bit, and it's not, it's just science, essentially. It's never perfect. And so I think for some people it's, and then of course there are people which is related to that view saying that, for example, well, we would never expect everything to be replicable to begin with, obviously. And like, how many studies should replicate? Like, what is actually the level we want to be at, or we should be at, to be maximally efficient? Because having everything completely replicable might also not be ideal, because it might mean that we are spending an enormous amount of resources on any individual study, and that might be wasteful as well. And so people can basically, I think, argue about the degree to which where things should be, like what the optimal level of different factors should
be.
I think that, sorry.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Anna made, I think, the two main points is you could either argue that science is just that's supposed to be that way and the problem is actually overblown, or you could go into specific as replication, which we've seen quite a couple of times over the last couple of years, where people say that, naturally we wouldn't expect things to replicate because you can't step in the same river twice. For example, things change. So how could you replicate something in a different sample at a different time, maybe using different stimuli, and that we should actually not expect things to replicate? My counter argument there would be, then why are we giving policy advice or any sort of advice? We naturally generalize our results from our study population to the wider world and the wider community. And so if we would take that stance of we can't step in the same river twice, then we would always say, well, my study of 100 university students from the University of Bristol found that filling out this questionnaire had an effect on filling out another questionnaire. And we would never really actually get to that point, where a lot of psychologists want to be giving advice, being in contact with the public, being in contact with policy, something that we're driven to be ever more, which is something I also think about a lot.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah, I would say I generally agree with Annie, with Anne as well. But I have, I think, a similar opinion as Annie, and especially being a Brazilian. It's like, I've talked about this a few days ago. It's like when we read papers, international papers in English, it's really odd to us, or weird, as we it's now a famous acronym in psychology, is how people tend to overgeneralize from the US and European and etc. samples. And we when we submit papers, people usually say things like, but why you study generalizable if you're doing it with Brazilian participants? It is improving right now, but I've met plenty of colleagues who went through a similar experience. And so this sort of bias, I don't know if cognitive bias, but it's a cognitive bias, but it's it really bothers me in general is why we tend to overgeneralize and make such big claims out of individual and biased studies. So I think if we solved only that kind of problem in reporting our studies and samples, I think a great deal of our problems would be, I don't know if it's solved, but at least would be more humble regarding our theories. And I'm thinking about your question on why people think that there isn't no crisis, because that's what you asked Holger before. And it's, I confess I don't know. And in Brazil, we have this experience where what we learn in some universities is we have this Brazilian social psychology, and we learn that there has been a crisis before, and now we don't believe in that kind of model. And then many psychologists in Brazil do a sort of qualitative research, so investigating social representations, or conducting interviews and sometimes surveys with participants or case studies, because they a lot of social psychologists lost their confidence in a sort of positivistic US centralized psychology in the 70s. So for us, it's not really a new thing, these kind of discussions, but this has been a long, there is a long history of psychologists claiming different types of crises in psychology. And I think what's different now is that, of course, the Open Science Collaboration paper and the focus on replication, but also I think the sort of methods that we have available right now, especially with use of the internet and computational tools that we can use. So I think that's why we are sort of moving towards perhaps some sort of change. But I really don't understand much why people think everything was fine at the beginning, to begin with.
Right, Gordon, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just to quickly come back to your question, why are the people saying there's no crisis? So for me, one real cool article or blog article that tackled this question was also by Daniel Larkins, where he kind of compared it to mourning of the old system, right? And the Kubler-Ross phases of mourning. And I do think there's a lot of denial going on. Because if we admit there is a crisis, then we have to change what we are doing now, and we don't really want to do that. We prefer just as scientists to continue on our path. This is what we learned to do. We think it works. It lets us discover things, we think. So we are not so much in favor of changing our ways. And I think there's a lot of that going on. And that is also shown a bit in the dynamic that of the deniers, many have been in the field for a long time, whereas the younger researchers are much quicker in adopting the new ways. So I think that's really a strong part of the explanation. And I really suggest reading this blog article by Daniel, because it really makes you think about yourself as well. So if you're skeptical, read it. It really helps.
Right. Oh, that's a very good recommendation. Thanks. Okay, so I think we all on this panel, you all agree that there is a crisis, or that there has been a crisis, maybe, I don't know. So what do you think is specifically the problem? What is more precisely the problem? Natalia already said that part of it is that we're overgeneralizing over cultural differences, maybe. But what do other people think, or do you also have other thoughts on that? What is more precisely the problem, actually? What are we doing wrong?
So I wouldn't mind jumping in right at the beginning, if everybody is okay with that. I think there's no one answer to this question. I think there's, depending on what field you're in, there is a different answer. So for example, I can say it about my field because I'm well thought into it. We have a huge power problem. And it's actually difficult in cognitive neuroscience or biological psychology to just scale up how many participants you have. So in my field, sleep and memory, for the last 20 years, the sample size was roughly 20 subjects, maybe even less, between 10 and 20 for within subjects design. And if you look at the power curve, that's ridiculous. You can say near nothing about medium or small effects. If you're lucky, you can say something about large effects, right? And we actually probably know there's no large effects really in at least in my field. And I know this is the case for many different paradigms in the general cognitive neuroscience. If you look at imaging, running large studies is hard, and so on. And that is what I would identify as one of the driving problems in my field. But I think in other places it might be very different, right? Maybe there open data is a larger problem, right? Finding errors in coding stuff or the way stuff is analyzed might be a much larger problem. That's not to say that we don't also have to think about pre-registration and stuff like that. I think these are also issues, but they might not be quite as strong, at least in my view, as this power problem.
Right. Well, thanks. That is definitely one of the problems that everybody's always talking about. What do other people think?
I'd like to give a counter or push back a little bit. I do see a huge problem with regard to connected to pre-registration and to so one of the biggest problems I see field across subfields, even though it does vary across subfields. It's not the same, but it does affect, I think, almost all subfields of psychology, is that we are overestimating the evidence that we have for our scientific claims. We are misrepresenting the evidence we have, both the amount of evidence and the quality of the evidence that we have. And a lot of that is simply due to lack of transparency about about the number of tests that were run, for example, how we what was predicted before the fact and what wasn't. And so essentially we're still in the habit of writing up studies after the fact in a narrative that just doesn't keep track of where the process went, and that doesn't keep track of all the research degrees of freedom that were exploited. And I see that studying registered reports and pre-registrations, that still happens when people adopt pre-registrations, and if they don't, it's just orders of magnitude worse. But I think a lot of that just has to do with how we were brought up and used to conducting research, where what we think we are doing when we're doing hypothesis testing research in particular, is just not what we're doing in fact, because we don't even have hypotheses that are specific enough a lot of the time. Again, this doesn't affect everybody to the same degree. And there are also some areas where hypothesis testing just isn't much of a thing to begin with. But even then, sometimes things are presented after the fact in a specific fashion. But we think we use this machinery of hypothesis testing that is very exact, and where statistics mean a very specific thing, and where power calculations mean a specific thing. But what we plug into that machinery is just extremely vague, and it only materializes as a specific thing once we have some data to work with, and then we start to form certain stories around it in our heads. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing to those stories. It just means that the evidence for those stories we end up with is not what we think it is, because we didn't keep track of all the counterfactuals. And we can't, because we don't have the level of precision that we would need to do that a priori. And I think an enormous amount, like a huge majority of researchers is not fully aware of the scope of this. And I think it really does lead to situations where we have what I would call bullshit mountains in the literature, where there are new research questions that are being studied in several studies, where a small literature is building up around something that turns out to just not be true, where like several research labs are publishing on something that we at some point find just doesn't exist. That just keeps happening, and I think it keeps happening because of this problem.
Right. Well, thanks very much. Before I come to the other two panelists, I think I would like to ask something in between, maybe Gordon and Anna, because I think there's one thing maybe common to your answer. So Gordon mentioned powers, and Anna mentioned making up, coming to conclusions after the fact, etc., and what you can probably also resolve with pre-registration. But both of these problems at least in some parts of psychological research, a little bit avoided by, I don't know, running experimental series, right? If you think about a classic, whatever, JP LMC paper or something, where you have, let's say, 5 experiments, they're all on the same topic. Generally, they find an effect in experiment 1, then they do something, they do a specific manipulation in experiment 2, and the effect, let's say, goes away, and it comes back in experiment 3, etc. So doesn't that kind of working kind of avoid these problems? What would you think?
Am I allowed first, or you want to go, Anna? I would say, in my perspective, so first of all, in my area, this doesn't happen a lot, right? We have more of series of experiments that are published in different papers. But if one study finds an effect and another doesn't, then usually the explanation is there's some moderator that is affecting it, right? And this also happens in these series of papers, of experiments, right? Then you have some explanation. But I mean, my perspective, I said power is the most strong problem. I see pre-registration as absolutely essential also in my field. So I don't think we're so much disagreeing there. But if I don't find the effect because I have too little power rather than because of my different manipulation, then it doesn't really tell me anything if I can't directly compare those two studies, right? I mean, I guess you could solve it by using equivalence testing or something like that, but I don't see people really doing that in these series of experiments. So I don't really think that's a very strong argument, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but like to me, the running multiple, like ideally we can do efficient research by, you know, maybe running series of smaller studies, for example, if we control our error rates in a clever way, for example, and we just sort of maximize the flexibility that we have, but keep in mind where we might go wrong. I think at least in research areas where that's possible and where that is done, it tends to increase the problem, and that's just because we have no system that really keeps track of all the steps that we take and the decisions that we change along the way, and that actually every single one of these experiments ends up getting published, right? And it's just the way in which that happens is so subtle. You know, often these might be run by students, and then some students do a better job than others, and some students are motivated to write it up and others are not. And so some things just fall along the wayside and get lost. And then I do think there's a bias to the ones that you can, write a better story about. And those might be more true, but they might not be. We might just be fooling ourselves and we're not realizing it. And so there's publication bias even within labs, essentially, of that kind. And then, of course, publication bias across labs might be an even bigger problem, because even if we solve these problems within individuals, we still have the problem that all the individuals that never ended up getting published, we just don't know about that evidence.
Right. Well, okay, thank you. Well, maybe we can hear from Natalia and Amy what they think about what the specific problem might be, actually.
Well, I think I wanted to go back to what Natalia said about humbleness. You know, if I go zoom all the way out, you know, there are specific problems in specific fields, and we're not just talking about psychology. You know, we're talking about other scientific fields as well. And I do think that we're in a scientific system that is incredibly pressurized. You know, we need to publish to have jobs. We need to publish to get grants. Once you're a PI, you need to get grants to keep on your postdocs. So you have a personal edge in the game as well. And we're in a very industrialized scientific system. You know, it's very different than 200, 300 years ago, where you would, you know, it was a very kind of naturally very privileged thing to do science, and people just had either their own money or other people's money that kind of kept them safe. But it is a very precarious system. And I think it does lead to the pressure to act fast, to publish fast, to hype results. You know, in the UK, we see a lot of pressure to have impact. Why, you know, or I was just at a funding conference where we were supposed to have, every person is supposed to think about a pathway to impact from the study that was funded. But the funding was only about 20,000 quid. So you're probably going to run one small study, but then you need to show that you're going to, you know, affect something afterwards. I don't think that's how science, you know, it's how the industrialized science works now, with all of us on our little building stations in a factory doing our job and having to get these quotas. And so naturally, I think there are these, you know, Anna and Gordon raise really important points that we can discuss, and we can discuss about methods, and we discuss about innovations there. But I think we need to discuss about research culture as well, and how do we build a better science that allows, you know, diverse participation, but a diverse participation in a safe environment. I think that's something that I don't know how to solve yet, and I think a lot of people are grappling with at higher funding echelons as well now, because I do think that why is it's what I tell my students almost every time during the open science lectures is what's good for science does not align with what's good for scientists. That's a problem. There you go.
Right. So I think.
Can I just jump in there shortly? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Do you disagree with my hyperbolic claim?
No, because actually I thought you, a couple of days ago I would have said exactly right, that's the problem. But we had a session where we discussed incentives for open science just a week or two back. And we actually, I realized that maybe the incentives aren't that bad. Maybe us telling each other as scientists that the incentives are so bad is one of the problems. So in Germany, at least, the funders are changing how they want proposals to be written. They want them to include open science statements. The universities are changing who they want to hire. They want to hire people who also have open science agendas. Not everywhere, but there is a real route to a career with using open science practices. And I think it's important for us to also change this view inside people's heads. Yes, open science is good for science, but it's also good for you. And I was on the other side of this question just a couple of days back, and I think it helps to change the narrative. Sorry, this was important.
Like, I don't think my papers would have been published where they're published if I didn't have my open scientific practices. And I don't think I would have the job I have now without the open scientific things are changing. But I still disagree that there is, at least in the environment that I've worked, there is an intense pressure to be productive. And that means getting out papers every year, not every 5 years, you know, because our contracts are 1 or 2 or 3 years and things like that. So I think that while I can now teach students open science practices and be confident that that will help them, they might hinder them, it might, in certain ways, it might put them in conflict with their supervisors. It might, you know, cause some issues, but I do think long-term it will help them. I think that there is still a long way to go, and there are some kind of more unsolvable issues that, for example, the Wellcome Trust's research culture program is trying to address, which is really interesting here in the UK. But yeah, I'd like to see what Natalia has to say as well.
Yeah, actually, you both beat me to it in a couple of things. So I think I just wanted to point out something that Emmy said about us being industrialized in science, which I agree, but I've been reflecting a lot on whether we may be industrialized, but not really professionalized. I don't know if this would be the correct word in English, but in a way that we don't really have, I think we don't seem to have specific tools either to support the transparency. I mean, of course, people here will say in this very panel, of course we have lots of tools, but in the sense that they are actually institutionalized. And I don't know if this is the correct word again, but anyway, but things like a specific process, like we see in other professions, like some sort of auditing, I don't know if auditing tools, where we can actually check whether scientists are reaching some milestones or checkpoints along the research process. There is this whole vibe, vibe of research being like a creative and sort of artisanal work, where we do it in our office and then we just publish the end product of that. And I'm inclined to think that maybe we should be try to be more professionals in that sense. So I really like the idea of the red teams that I think Nicholas Coles is proposing, if I'm forgetting, where they kind of check the methods. I don't know if any of it's involved in the project. I'm sorry if I don't know about it. And they kind of check the methods, the analysis process, something like that. I may be misremembering, and I really like the work some people are doing in the Psychological Science Accelerator, because this is such a huge group of people. We have these specific committees, and we have to check if the whole process of conducting the research is going smoothly. So we have like a committee for ethics, a committee for analysis and data methods. There is something for translations. We are conducting a work on how we can improve translation methods. This is something that we do in cross-cultural studies, for example, and we don't stop to think much about the simple things where the same construct means the same across cultures, measurement invariancy issues, and etc. So we are working on that as well. And this is something that even a huge community like the PSA, a community like the Accelerator, gives us the opportunity to try these things, work on these things with lots of data and etc. So I think it's a great opportunity to try those sort of more professional tools to try to sort of I don't know, improve maybe is the word of the research process, and really maybe make them look more transparent and reproducible in that sense. I'm reflecting a lot recently on how the structure that we have to conduct research, like we rely on students and short-term contracts to conduct the kind of research that maybe it's not the best structure for that kind of research that we do. So how do we conduct long-term research with large samples where when we have teams that are changing constantly over like 3, 4, 5 years, and sometimes the PI concentrate the resources, and it's very organized, and he or she are very organized, and they are able to do it. But it's not helpful, I think, for those involved, like the students and the postdocs, and other researchers that are moving from job to job, trying to conduct long-term research. I don't see how that could be sustainable. So it might be related to that. And finally, I agree that we can, I think if we change the incentives, like people can only have apply and have more chances to get jobs and funding when they adopt open science practices, I think that is the way to go. But I'm not sure how we can change the incentives, and they are tricky, because if we change the incentives, people may try to game the system and trying to get their way around them. So I don't really have an answer for that. So I think that's what I had to say for now on that.
Well, thank you. I think we will come back to this question of I don't know what the role of the bigger system or the incentives, etc. is. I was actually asking you could you, we have a few questions from the audience, so we will actually go to that, but could you just very briefly tell us what the Psychological Science Accelerator is? I'm not sure whether we have, I think, a lot of undergrad students in our attendees, and not everybody might know what that is. Could you just say very briefly what
I can, I mean, my pleasure, but I mentioned briefly at the beginning, when I was introducing myself, and I pasted the link in the chat. So if anyone is interested, I encourage you to read more about it. But the Psychological Science Accelerator is a global network of laboratories in psychology. It's a voluntary network, so you can everyone works there voluntarily, and it was created in 2017 by Chris Chartier and a number of other psychological researchers, but he's currently our director and really the guy who had the idea. And I think PSA is very revolutionary in some sense, that there are a lot of so it's we try to be a decentralized and democratic network. So we are divided in committees, and we have a group of directors that I'm an assistant director to the community building network expansion for PSA. But we conduct every year or so, we conduct a call. We open a call for studies, and anyone can submit a psychological study to PSA, given that you follow some rules. I can talk about the limitations of these rules later, but we have some rules for feasibility. And if your study is selected, you have the support of the whole network for conducting your study over the world. So, and then you have also the support of the whole logistics of the process. So you have people helping you out with developing the study. The whole process is follow reproducible methods. So, for example, you're supposed to submit a project in the format of a registered report. But you have later the support of people from data methods and ethics and translation, and it's very interesting. We have now, I think, about 6 projects, and also a number of others looking on COVID. So we have the 6 main studies, and we have a number of others that are studying psychological effects on the coronavirus pandemic. Of the coronavirus pandemic. And I think we will open a call soonish, another call soonish, and we so anyone can be a member. We have this bit of a problem where we always say you can we are a network of labs, but labs is a very loose term. So it's actually, if you're a student and you want to join us, you can join us. If you are able to collect data or submit a project being an ECR in any moment of your career, you can as well. So you don't have to have a lab to be a member or lead a study. We're trying to increase our cultural diversity, more specifically cross-national diversity. We still have a big weird problem, which is
I think we might have lost Natalia. In that case, can we maybe go to the questions from the attendees, Trivi?
Yeah, so there's a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm just gonna go down the list, and maybe the panelists can speak for what they think they answer to each specific questions. So the first question from Ulrich. Do you want to ask the question, or you want me to read it?
sorry, I think I just yeah.
That's
I was
okay.
away for a while. So
Okay.
yeah, that's it. Sorry, and I don't know where you lost me, but I think I gave the general idea.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna read one of the questions from the from the Q&A. So, so this question is specifically about data sharing. When should data be fully available and shared, and when should analysis coding scripts not be available and shared? So you can share your thoughts based on what you think is a correct practice, or from your own experience and your own discipline.
I'm happy. Oh, Amy, do you want to?
No, I think for me, it's data is very different from analysis and coding scripts. I think I don't see a very big problem in sharing analysis and coding scripts. I don't know if the panel, if anybody disagrees, let me know, because that is really like showing you're working at school. You know, when we were in a math class, we were always told to, you know, go through and show our working, and it's really show me, not trust me there. I don't know, Anna, if you want to talk about the data more.
Yeah, that would have been my point. I'm on the Open Science Committee of the German Psychological Society, and we just released a revised set of data sharing guidelines. So from that perspective, what the current stance of the German Psychological Society is, at least, is that data should be open by default. So unless there are good reasons why they shouldn't be, and good reasons why they shouldn't be are for mostly data privacy issues. So if data is sensitive to an extent that there, for example, is a great risk of subjects being re-identified or identifiable from the data that you're sharing, that shouldn't be the case, and some data cannot be anonymized sufficiently to prevent that from happening. And the other concern that might exist, I think that's unusual in psychology, but it can be the case, is that data could be ethically problematic in the wrong hands. So for one example might be that they might allow the development of specific weapons or bioweapons, chemical weapons, something like that, where you think that not everybody should have access to this information because it could be misused in very dangerous ways. And importantly, in my opinion, it's not just black and white sharing and not sharing. You should share as much as possible, but not more. And if data are sensitive to some degree, you can take precautions to share only certain aspects of the data that are safe. So for example, remove some variables that are sensitive or that would allow re-identification, or in the worst case, so let's say data are so sensitive that it's really problematic to share them, you could still share the metadata, for example. So you can show us exactly which variables you have, how they were structured and so on, or you could even share a synthetic data set where you basically create a fake data set that is based on your real data, and where we know how that was done.
Can I quickly pitch in there too? I think one part of this question is also the effort you have to put in to share data and code. And I think often the question isn't, should I, for whatever reason, do it or not? It's, can I be bothered to do it? And if you haven't incepted or constructed your research to be open from the get-go, then it's much harder sharing your data than if you did that. So telling people an old data set you're supposed to share it is a lot of work. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we kind of judge about people. And I will openly say I have a lot of data sets that look crap, and I could just put them on the web, but that would help no one. I would have to put a lot of effort into making them accessible. And I actually tried to do that for some of them, but yeah, it's a lot of work. I just want to put that out there so that we stay in the realm of what is real also when we talk about this stuff.
Well, so my point was from essentially first principle, like what ought to be the case, right? So my perspective is, yes, it is a lot of work. I think it is work that we should be paid for and have the resources to do well, right? And that is a structural problem, but that is a different question from whether it ought to be shared or not.
Yeah, thank you. So let's go to another question from the Q&A. And so the one highly rated questions from the audience. So researchers from low and middle income countries struggle to run large scale studies due to the lack of funding. So I think a few of you kind of touch on the issues of funding available for projects. So this might be difficult for them publish now because of the scientific reforms and having to adopt open science practices. So what's your advice for them when designing a study based on an open science methodology?
I wish Natalia would be here. She like appear and be like, hello. I've got my PhD student works with rural Indian populations. That's her main kind of interest is. And so naturally it's different having kind of being a researcher at the University of Cambridge and doing research. Naturally we have the funding and the connections, for example, with government to actually say, let's do a large scale study. But I think what her perspective is around this open science is that it's almost even more critical for us to give the support to lower and middle income researchers because it is so crucial that research is replicable and that it's worth it. You know, if you have even less public funding, you want to waste less. You know, you could and if you think about how much research money is wasted on a global scale, it means that in those countries where it is severely limited, you should try to find a way in a system to make that work. Naturally, that system will need to be built. It's often not there yet. And that's talking through her experience and not mine. So I'm very much kind of the mediator of these experiences here. But I do feel like there is, oh, thank God Natalia's back. There is possibility of crowdsourcing, and that's where we're answering the top question if you want to prepare. But I think that we often get this not only for low and middle income country researchers, but also for other types of research, which is very costly, neuroimaging research, primate research, you know. And so I think for those, we normally, kind of my normal answer is that then that's where it gets really valuable to try to crowdsource and try to work together collaboratively and pool resources. And that's where the Psychological Science Accelerator or Many Babies or Many Primates those initiatives are really valuable. That's it for me.
I just want to add one very technical point, which is more efficient statistics. So for example, sequential designs are more efficient where you plan to look at your data at several points and you plan it in such a way that your alpha error doesn't get inflated. And on average, with those designs, you will need smaller samples. So there are some things like that where you can maximize efficiency.
Sorry, my internet is spotty, so I missed the question. Sorry, I muted myself.
Natalia, I pasted it in the, do you see the questions? Okay.
Okay, yeah, I saw. I'm just reading it now. So I tend to agree with what Anne just said, but because we are still trying to figure out how to use those methods, I'm still learning how to use them. I would say I encourage people I always encourage people here to become a member on PSA. And although your study won't be run by PSA if you don't if it doesn't get selected, you can always reach to people there. So people are actually making collaborations all the time because they meet each other through the network. I really like the idea of, I don't know if someone mentioned already, that apart from improving the methods and being humble in your conclusions, but I like that if you don't have enough sample size for some of the questions that you want to ask, you can actually either publish them temporarily, like in a preprint or something like that, and seek for collaborators where you can actually try to increase your sample size by adding collaborators to your study. if someone disagrees with that, if I'm wrong in this rationale, please correct me. But I like things like, for example, the CRAPE project, where you have those students collecting data for replications, and then you can combine all the data from them in a big study and publish and conduct like more proper analysis regarding the power of the analysis and publish them. So I think I just want to say that this sort of feeds into a view of research as a continuous process, so that doesn't end in publishing something. So you can always have like a work in progress, and then joint efforts with other people and improve on the quality of that work.
So kind of piggyback on that question, do you think that, so one of the questions is, do you think the reliance on student populations that usually social psychology psychologists usually use contribute to the poor replication crisis? And is it partly because most of the student is from the weird countries, so-called weird countries, and that's why we have the problem with replicability?
So if I may, I still think that the main issue is that people choose to conduct those studies and overgeneralize from them. I mean, I would be fine with a journal where I won't mention any journals, so I don't want to piss off anyone, but I would be okay with any journals where you had like a lot of studies with undergraduate students from US, for example, but they actually say things like, we can only generalize from our samples up until that point. It's really tricky because sometimes we can even generalize from the sample to other students, undergraduate students in US, for example. But it would be fine for me, personally, if I read the paper where people say, well, we did that with Yale students and we found this. It's interesting. It's an interesting idea, but we can only say much in other groups. And I think if people did that, they would have realized that, well, maybe we should try a little bit harder or differently, because our study isn't really saying much of anything. But so I don't like to blame that on the replicability crisis on that specifically. I like to blame on publication bias, particularly. But I do think nowadays is part of the problem. So we need to think hard about why people are asking specific questions and looking to those questions only using students to get credits, and the students in their university. And I think it also feeds into what Emmy said about, we have pressure to work fast and publish fast, so it's easier to get data that way. So it's really hard to, for example, we have, like, of course there are plenty of examples in psychology and anthropology, but if in Brazil, for example, I have a colleague that she went to very distant communities from the city, and sort of distance, like takes like about almost 2 hours to get there, to collect data in a very small group of people who live in a community of descendants of former enslaved people in Brazil. So we have these specific communities, and she did that to test a specific hypothesis, and she took like months to do that. So it's different when you can collect data of 2,000 people in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes, and by using an online website. So I think there's a place for everyone, but this over reliance on these kind of samples is something that we have really to reckon with urgently.
Anna, go ahead.
I just want to push back slightly again. I mean, I don't really disagree much with anything you just said. I I just think that, to me, relying on student samples is a problem for generalizability reasons, but it's not the core of the replication crisis to me, because we can't even replicate studies that were done on students with other students, right? So that is a thing right there. That's not that the problem isn't that you didn't use a more diverse sample to begin with. What I do think is that it shows, or it's one of the symptoms of psychology, or big parts of psychology, and maybe especially social psychology, being quite myopic in my view. So one thing that I find much more satisfying is to take more like anthropologists' perspectives into account that are a bit broader and a bit more, often seem much more common sense about human nature to me when I hear about them, and it often makes me realize how hyper sort of focused we in psychology have become on tiny things, and forget about actual human beings and actual human nature, and how humans work in groups. And if you do that, you automatically pay more attention to more diverse groups and populations, and realize how things have to fit together. And I think that perspective might help with our, what I think is a theory crisis as well. And having stronger theories might lead us to have hypotheses that have better prior probabilities and are not as random and weird. And that might then in the long run also help with reproducibility, but that's a much more indirect link to me.
Can I just say something quickly about that? I completely agree with you, and I think I always speak from the place of someone who isn't that good with methods yet. I hope I'll improve eventually, but I think you're right. I've seen these perspectives on Twitter often. Like, if you have a good study, a well-designed study, and from the beginning, perhaps these also wouldn't be like such big issues to begin with. But yeah, so if you have like sort of only intuitions and poor developed methods, it would be helpful if people would be a little bit more humble about not knowing stuff. Sorry about that.
No, I completely agree.
So I guess that this would be a good time also to get to another question. What would you consider a successful replication?
It depends.
Yeah, this is, I think people there, I think the Open Science Collaboration had like 5 different definitions of what a successful replication was. I hope so I think it was like, if the p-value of the replication was, significant, if the pooled effect size was, if the confidence interval of the pooled effect size doesn't cross 0, if the effect size is significantly different from the other one, if the researcher themselves thought it replicated or not, and then there's another one, which I forgot. So yeah, it's a big question, and I think people do really struggle with this in kind of newly funded projects, like the big replication initiative funded by DARPA, or kind of in conversation, this often comes up. And I think I've not heard like the one golden rule answer. So as Anna said, it definitely depends, and people have struggled with this question.
I would just say that, to me, a lot hinges on the original study, and that's where things get so difficult very often. So I think the problems we have at defining what constitutes a successful replication often reflect then our original studies, that they are underdefined, basically. So what you want, ideally, I think an ideal case would be, we have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis predicts, for example, that the effect size should be in a specific range. And we have one study that found the effect size in that specific range. And then we can test the hypothesis again with a second study and see if it's still in the same range. Right now, what does tend to happen is we have studies that find a difference that's not 0, something, and nobody knows how big the effect should be. And if any, you could run a replication study that finds that the effect is like, you have a hugely powered study, you find a significant effect, but the effect is like a cohency of 0.001 one or something. Well, that's very, you would need too many people for that. But and then is that a successful replication? Well, probably not, right? But we can't we can't figure this out unless somebody says, well, that's not the effect that I meant. So we need to define the effect that we mean more precisely, and that should be on the original authors or on the community to figure out, is this, what effect are we interested in?
So does it sound like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Gordon.
So yeah, if I may, sometimes I think this is a bit of an academic discussion, and I'm not sure if it really matters for so many researchers whether or not you consider one specific study as a successful or unsuccessful replication. I mean, in general, we say we shouldn't rely on one study to make any kind of claim anyway, and I don't think many researchers really do that. We look at the available evidence. We might have 5 studies, 2 find the effects, 3 don't find the effects, and then I would kind of try to interpret from that, there may be something or there may be not. This would be a very different situation if I have 5 studies finding the effect, right, that are all corroborating each other's evidence. Just saying this one study replicates or doesn't replicate, that's not really how statistics works, I think, and it doesn't really tell us anything about whether we should believe there is an effect there or not. So I don't really see the point of necessarily discussing this outside of wanting to know from a meta-science perspective, maybe.
So does it sound like, do you think that replications and replicability only apply to quantitative research? Or, so that's part of the same attendees asked that question as well. So is it not relevant when it comes to qualitative research?
I just want to say that's a very interesting question that I don't have a good answer to. But I'm very interested in this. I'm starting to do a bit more qualitative work myself, but I'm extremely inexperienced with it. And so to me, it is obviously on a very different level. Like, can you talk about replicability of a certain insight from some interviewed data? What would that even mean, right? And that also depends, because there's a lot of diversity within qualitative research, I guess. I do think there are some papers coming out on what open science means for qualitative research. That might be interesting to look up, but I really don't feel qualified to answer the question.
Well, I'll just, provide an educated guess. I'm trying to conduct more qualitative studies, but so my background is in experimental psychology, although I do conduct these experiments in schools. But as it happens, we observe certain things that we wanted to account for, and we know that our methods aren't adequate to that. So, and in Brazil, we actually have a long tradition of teaching those kind of methods. But when you are interested in quantitative methods, you sort of steer away from them, which is ironic now for me. But what I know about qualitative studies is you have some methods, some ways of converging evidence. So when we conduct interviews, you have some sort of methods where you can actually check if the topic's saturated or people keep addressing the same things, I think. I might be wrong about that, but what I know is that it's feasible. And I'm really a big fan of ethnographic studies, although these also have their own kind of issues. But long-term observations of communities and different reports can be combined to try to have sort of a big picture of some sort of phenomena. So I really like this kind of approaches. Maybe Tweety has some insight about qualitative studies, because I think I've seen her, tweeting about that at some point with someone, I think. So I'm just kind of suggesting that.
No, I'm just touching on that, like Ain also, just because there's several methods to analyze qualitative data also, whether or not you do like thematic analysis or ground theories or so. I think the tough part is to pick one approach to go with. And then, so yeah, so I don't think that I'm at that level to be qualified to answer the question either.
I guess I would just say maybe like one aid to do that is always to ask yourself, well, what aspect of this research should be replicable or reproducible, or how could it be wrong? You know, like what are mistakes that we could be making, and how do we want to protect ourselves against that? So in a practical way, that I think can be helpful.
Yeah, I do think though in the planning process, you can be very clear. So usually with qualitative data, I would train students to like using Google Doc or some, so that everyone need to put in who code what data at what step, because there's several steps into approaching qualitative data. And then so we know at what point bias might be introduced in, because from a naive coders, I would say that would be less biased. But if me being the researchers already knowing what I want to look at, whenever I put in there that that's when I code the data, then I know there's level of bias. So with qualitative research, I think I think that advice is that just try to be as honest as possible about the kind of bias that we can introduce in. But yeah, I think I don't know if Holger, do we have other questions, or should we continue with the questions from the Q&A?
I don't know. We could, if you want to.
I think this next.
But you can go on, of course. Yeah.
Oh, because I know that we also have other questions about the incentive, which will touch on to one of the questions about how we can continue the funding, and maybe because each of you come from different countries and have different work with probably different funding agency and initiatives, how do we think that we can continue funding for open science, and also to make sure replicability and reproducibility of science? And I think that's touch on one of the questions that Holger's has about the incentive as well.
Sorry, Trivi, what is the exact question? Sorry.
So the question is how we can ensure continued funding for social interventions, and not just in developing countries, but developed countries, but also in developing countries, to make sure that our science will be will continue to be replicable and reproducible.
So nobody else wants to say anything. So I'm not sure if my answer is in any way adequate to the question. But at least for Germany, I can say that here, if you write a proposal for funding to our major funding body, then you have to make sure that you are fulfilling good scientific practice. And I think basically open science is a way of operationalizing good scientific practice. And I do think that actually the major funding body, the DFG, is more and more leaning in that direction to think that as well, at least in the psychological part of the funding. But much more relevant, I think, is what the reviewers do. Because I don't really think the funders have that much sway into who gets which money. The reviewers, at least in Germany, and I also know this for a lot of the UK funders where I've done reviewing, and also in France, if the reviewer says there's not enough open science in this project, then it's not going to get funded if you flag that up as a major point and you give a good argument. So I think anybody who's doing reviewing for funding agencies, and that's where it goes in the broader picture, can influence what kind of practices people have to display so that they get money. And that is a major driver of incentives. And that's us, right? So I think we just have to agree that this is what we want. And then that's what people will have to do. That's part of why earlier on I got a bit, had to discuss that one point, because I think we need to change what people think, right? We have to make, this is what we expect from people. That's what you have to review the grant for. And if it's not in there, you have to flag it. And that's one major way of getting funders to do what we want.
I actually, early in the discussion between you and Amy, I was actually going to say that I don't think what you were saying was at odds with each other, because to me the incentives are not something that are imposed on us from some external force that are external to everything. But the incentives, I mean, it's a shorthand for something very complex in a complex social system. Of course, they are enacted by us, right? And so, of course, it is on us to change the incentives to some extent. It's just that it's not up to just one individual, and it's very difficult to just make that decision because it's this complex. Everything is influencing everything else, and everyone is influencing everyone else. And so it's this tragedy of the group situation very often, where if we all decided to to downrate proposals that don't have enough open science in them, that would be great. But how do we get to the point where that is actually a popular position for enough people to have? I do think it is super important, because it's not just like Gordon, as you said. I do agree that the reviewers in the funding process, even though I have very little experience with this, but based on what I know, that they do have the most power. And it's not just because the funders don't have the power, but the funders are very reluctant to impose field-specific rules onto a scientific discipline, because they say, you are the experts, like you researchers, you have to tell us what's good science in your field. So that's why they will always tend to be quite conservative with this, or like leave it to us. And then it's up to us to do that. One thing that I'm quite concerned about, like I do see that several funders are interested in that and are making steps towards trying to reward more reproducible and open science. One thing that I'm concerned about is that it might end up being a box ticking exercise, because now you can add some requirements, some sections in your proposal that you add. And if it just boils down to making some blanket statements, or to, putting some data file on the OSF at some point, regardless of how good it is, then it'll fail, and it'll fail its purpose, because people will always take the easiest path to pass those barriers.
So we would need to wrap up soon. So there's still two questions in the chat box. So if you guys want to check the Q&A, and maybe can type the questions there. But I think, Holger, do you want to do a wrap up?
I don't know. I actually don't know. When are we going to stop here? When
2:30. Yeah.
2:30. Okay. Well, I was actually asking, or one thing that I would actually wanted to ask you is, I'm sorry when I'm cutting the questions in the Q&A off, but maybe this is very quick and we can have more than one question. What do you think would be a good practical advice for somebody who just wants to do something more open sciencey now? What is a good step in your particular field to be a little bit, as a first step, more open?
Well, I can start, maybe. I think I just said it at the beginning. I really like Christina Bergman's approach, or the buffet approach, buffet, I don't know, buffet approach, where so you have to pick on things that are easier for you first, and perhaps not try to judge yourself too much. And so what I've been trying to do is to share preprints of what I've been writing when it's possible, because sometimes I work with other people and they aren't too keen on that. But also start sharing things gradually. And I realized recently I shared my first code and a date. I don't know if I did it correctly, given the discussion on that, but it was a good exercise, because once I did that, one of the reviewers actually looked into it, which was really great. And but I realized that I tried to be more careful when I was writing the code, and realized a lot of blind spots reasoning. So I think it really helps if you are kind to yourself. It really helps with starting to be more open in your, when it's possible, of course, in the field to do that.
I think those are really nice, like I completely agree, and I would have said the same. A really nice way in which I motivate grad students is that like the person with the highest probability of reusing your data and your code and your writing in 2-3 years time is yourself. And you know, you in the past is not going to answer any emails or give you any help. And so really kind of thinking about, even if you don't share it, adding enough information that it is understandable and kind of almost making it shareable, even if you don't decide to put it online, can be extremely helpful. Like my first PhD project, I wouldn't even know how to make the first variable. You know, it was like I log transformed them and then I like split them, and I don't know where to even start when somebody asked me, you know, can I have the correlation for a meta-analysis, for example. And so I think that's a really great motivator as well, to start saying, actually, let me put everything in an organized folder system and have all the details available to reproduce my findings just for myself. And then it's easier to then start putting things and sharing things online when you're comfortable. And also knowing that nothing's ever perfect. You know, everybody's code is messy. It's not perfect. It's never clean enough. But it's all about, I think if we would start sharing it, we would start normalizing that we make errors and we're a bit messy at certain times and things like that.
Yeah, I completely agree with those points, and especially with the notion that this will be helpful for yourself. Like you will love your old you who did these steps for future you sometime in the future. I want to add one maybe stretch goal for the person starting out, which is consider doing a registered report for a new study, which I think is, to me, it's kind of the gold standard for reproducible research. But I think it is a lot less daunting than that may sound. So there are some good reasons why people can find it actually less scary than doing a study normally. For example, Emma Henderson tends to make this point, and she's doing all of her all studies in her PhD as registered reports, which I find super impressive. And she says for her, it's less scary because she gets feedback before she runs the study, and she actually gets this help in creating a really good study, and it makes it easier for her to do that research and to sleep at night and not be so worked up about what will happen and how she'll be able to make sense of it after the fact. So it actually, you can see it as a help of scaffolding your whole research workflow in a way that's just more efficient and also nicer for you and actually easier to work with, even though it might feel like a very big change in the first instance.
So maybe I also share a couple of thoughts there. I totally agree with what's been said. I guess the perfect is kind of the enemy of the good, right? Start where you can. Whatever small thing you change, I think is perfect. For me, for example, I think the first thing I started with was I wrote a pre-registration on aspredicted.com, which kind of in hindsight is really crappy, right? I mean, it's like 5 sentences or something like that. But that's where I started, right? And we're now just publishing that study. So yeah, that's kind of 4 years ago, I wrote something on as predicted, and we actually did exactly that, and that's fine. I'm not sure if I agree with the advice to start with a registered report, because we've done registered reports in my group now, and it's a lot more work than I thought. And I think it really depends on which field you're in. For cognitive neuroscience, it's a ton of work, and here we actually nearly bit off more than we could swallow, and I would really advise against doing that. Do something small, get into the thing, and then just pile it on as you can. I understand that that wasn't what you're saying, but I just want to advise against really trying to do everything at once.
Well, I just want to say, I did say it was a stretch goal, and I do fully agree that it does depend on the field, on the research question, on the circumstances. There are big differences. I do think in some cases it can be feasible even for a PhD student, as some people are proving. But yeah, obviously it won't just be possible for everybody, or advisable maybe even.
Right. Well, thank you all very much. I think we are actually slightly over time already. What do you think, Tweety?
No, but this is nice that all the questions from the Q&As are actually answered. So thank you so much. And I think this is a very interesting and lively discussion.
Okay. Well, is that the end of the discussion then? Okay, well then, thank you all very, very much for joining us today. It has been really great. I think we have not really discussed everything that we wanted to discuss or that I had in mind, but this is probably always the case. Anyway, thanks to all the panelists for joining us today. Thanks for everybody who attended. Thanks to
yeah, the webinar is recorded, and thank you. Yeah.
For organizing this. The webinar is recorded. If anybody ever wants to have a look at this again, that's possible. If you know where it will be posted, TV.
I think Andrew will have the question. We go to answer that question better than me, because I think we plan to. So we did send out an email to all of you, and we plan to put that on our department website, if that's okay, so that will be available publicly to everyone.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, thanks again, everybody. Yeah, I hope you will all be successful with your open science activities and your science activities generally. And yeah, thanks again. Bye.